Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I had always thought of my room as a place of solitude. It was my refuge from the noise of the world. At night, when everything was still, I would lie in bed, listening to the distant hum of the city. It was peaceful, and for a long time, I found comfort in that silence. But it wasn't long before that silence started to change. It began on a night much like any other. I had just settled into bed, the room dark and quiet. The only sound was the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath me, a reminder of how long this house had stood. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, when I heard a faint, almost imperceptible noise. A soft rustling sound, like something moving in the shadows, just beyond the edge of my bed. I opened my eyes and strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. The room was still, save for the quiet hum of the air. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside brushing against the windows. But then it came again. This time, it was more distinct, more deliberate. A faint scuffing noise, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I held my breath, my heart beginning to race. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But then I heard the footsteps. They were soft, almost too quiet to be real, but unmistakable. They seemed to come from under the bed. The sound was so subtle at first that I thought I was imagining it. But then, with every passing second, it grew louder and clearer. I froze. The footsteps were slow, measured. Whoever, or whatever, was under there was moving, creeping closer to me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stared at the dark space beneath my bed, trying to make sense of the sound. My eyes darted across the room, searching for anything that might explain it, but the shadows offered no answers. The footsteps came closer. I could hear them now, faint and soft, but undeniably there. I wanted to scream, to call out for someone, anyone, but the sound of those footsteps paralyzed me. My body refused to move. I felt trapped in the stillness, alone with whatever was lurking beneath me. I had to look. I had to see what it was. With trembling hands, I reached for the edge of the bed and slowly began to pull it back. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind screamed at me to stop, to leave it alone. But I couldn't. I had to know. I pushed the bed back as far as it would go, my hands shaking with fear. My eyes searched the darkness beneath the bed, scanning every inch for any sign of movement. And then I saw them. Two eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, staring straight at me. They were wide and unblinking, fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The eyes didn't blink, didn't shift. They just stared, unblinking, unfeeling, like something not quite human. Something that didn't belong. My heart raced, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't tear my gaze away from those eyes, unable to understand what I was seeing. They were too close, too real, and yet somehow they felt wrong. The footsteps stopped. Everything went still again. The only sound was my racing heartbeat, the silence of the room pressing on me like a heavy weight. I didn't know what to do, what to think. I had to get out of there. I had to leave, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I finally tore my eyes away from the bed, and without thinking, I scrambled out of the room, slamming the door behind me. The sound of my feet pounding against the floor echoed in my ears as I ran down the hallway, away from that place, away from the eyes I could still see in my mind. But even as I reached the safety of the hallway, the footsteps remained in my ears, soft and measured. They were still there, under the bed, waiting for the next night. And I knew, somehow, I would hear them again. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the couch in the living room, my eyes fixed on the dark hallway that led to my bedroom. The silence was suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified, each rustle of the wind outside felt like a whisper just beyond my door. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that there was a reasonable explanation for the footsteps I heard under the bed. But deep down, I knew the truth. The eyes, their unblinking stare, they weren't from anything human. They were something else, something dark. It was around midnight when the noises started again. At first, it was just the wind, a soft whistle through the cracks in the old house. But then, I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails against wood. I tensed, my heartbeat quickening. It was coming from my room. I knew what it was, but I couldn't stop myself from standing up and walking toward the hallway. I didn't want to go back there. I didn't want to face what I'd seen. But I had to. The curiosity, the fear, it pulled me back to that room, to the place where everything had changed. I reached the door, my hand hovering over the handle. For a moment, I stood there, listening. The sound of my own breath filled the silence. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it again. A soft scuffing noise. It was closer this time. I didn't know if I was ready, but I opened the door. The room was just as I had left it, dark and empty, the bed against the far wall, the shadows gathering in the corners. Nothing seemed out of place. But the air felt thick, charged with something that made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. I walked over to the bed, my gaze fixed on the space beneath it. I could feel something watching me, something waiting. But I couldn't see anything. The darkness beneath the bed was absolute. Then, there it was again. A footstep. Just one. Soft, but distinct. It came from under the bed, and this time it was louder, clearer. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I backed away from the bed, my eyes darting around the room. Was it still there? Was it just my mind, playing tricks again? Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, heart racing, breath coming in sharp gasps. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in around me. I turned back to the bed, and that's when I saw it. The eyes. Two glowing, yellowish eyes, staring at me from the darkness beneath the bed. I froze, my legs refusing to move, my mind screaming at me to run, to escape, but I couldn't. The eyes held me in place, unblinking, unfeeling. There was something in those eyes, a deep, hollow void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate. They were closer now, too close. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the blood pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come. I couldn't take my eyes off those glowing orbs. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest object, an old lamp from the nightstand, and hurled it toward the bed. The glass shattered with a sharp crack, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. The eyes disappeared. I stood there, waiting, heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what had just happened, but I knew one thing, it was real. The thing under the bed, whatever it was, had been watching me. And now it was gone. I bolted from the room, not daring to look back. I didn't know if I was safe, but I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I ran out of the room and down the stairs, my breath ragged, my thoughts a blur. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every sound, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. And when the morning finally came, it didn't bring relief. It only brought more questions. What had I seen? What was under the bed? I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. And I knew one thing for sure, whatever it was, it hadn't left. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. School, work, even the mundane tasks of daily life all seemed distant, as if I were watching them through a thick fog. My mind kept returning to that room, to the eyes under the bed, to the thing that had been waiting for me. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just a bad dream. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That it was still there, somewhere in the house, watching, waiting. That night, I locked my bedroom door. I didn't feel safe anywhere else. I told myself that I was being paranoid, that nothing would happen, but deep down, I knew better. The house was silent again, the usual creaks and whispers of the old building almost comforting now. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the growing unease in my chest. Then, around midnight, it began. A soft rustling sound, just like before. But this time, it wasn't coming from under the bed. It was coming from the closet. I held my breath, my pulse racing. The closet door was slightly ajar, just enough to cast a thin sliver of darkness across the room. I watched it, my eyes locked on the crack, my mind spinning with possibilities. The rustling sound grew louder. It was unmistakable now. Someone, or something, was moving inside the closet. I didn't want to look. I knew what I would see. But my body moved on its own, my feet carrying me to the door before I could stop them. I reached for the knob and turned it slowly, the sound of the metal clicking in the stillness of the room. The door creaked open, revealing the dark interior of the closet. There was nothing there. At least, nothing I could see. But the air felt heavier now, thick with a presence I couldn't explain. The closet seemed to stretch on forever, as if it had grown larger since I had last looked inside. A strange, cold draft blew from the back of the closet, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to shut the door and forget about it, but something stopped me. Something urged me to look deeper, to search the darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And then I saw it. A figure. A shadow, just at the very edge of the closet, standing perfectly still. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape seemed to shift with the shadows. For a moment, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks again, but the more I stared, the more real it became. I could see the outline of its face, pale and featureless, just like the eyes I had seen under the bed. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as if the figure was holding me in place, its gaze locking onto mine even though I couldn't see its eyes. The air grew colder. I could feel its presence, its unnatural stillness. It didn't make a sound, but somehow I could hear it, feel it. It was waiting for me to make the first move. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. But I couldn't tear myself away from the door. I was frozen in place, my body locked in fear, my thoughts screaming for me to run. But I couldn't. And then, the figure moved. It was slow at first, a slight shifting of its form, but then it began to step forward. The sound was soft at first, like the whisper of fabric against the floor, but as it drew closer, it became more distinct. Footsteps. Just like before, but this time, they were coming from the closet. I slammed the door shut, my hand shaking as I locked it behind me. I could hear the footsteps on the other side, growing louder, closer. The sound echoed in my mind, filling the room with a growing sense of dread. I backed away from the closet, my eyes still fixed on the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The footsteps stopped. The room was silent again. For a moment, I thought it was over, that whatever was in my closet had gone away. But then, I heard something else. A soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the crack under the door. "Come closer." The voice was cold, hollow, like it had no life in it. It sent a chill through my entire body. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath shallow and quick as the whisper continued. "Come closer." I'm waiting. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body refused to move. All I could do was stand there, trembling, as the whispering continued, each word sending a deeper chill through my bones. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I bolted from the room, not looking back, my heart pounding in my ears. I ran down the hallway, past the stairs, and into the kitchen. The house felt like a maze now, the familiar walls closing in on me. But the whispers followed. They echoed through the house, growing louder, closer. And I knew that whatever was in that closet was still waiting for me. It wasn't over. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whispers, the footsteps, the thing in the closet, those images were burned into my mind. The house felt suffocating, like it was closing in on me with every passing minute. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was lurking in the shadows was waiting for me to come back, to confront it. But I didn't want to. I couldn't. The next day, I stayed away. I didn't return home. I went to a friend's place, anything to avoid going back to that house. I couldn't explain it to anyone. No one would understand. How could I? The thought of facing that thing under my bed or in the closet again was too much. But by nightfall, I knew I couldn't keep running. I returned home reluctantly, the weight of the house pressing down on me. The air felt thick and heavy, as if the house itself was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I had no choice. I had to face it. I locked every door, checked every window, made sure everything was in place. The house was silent, unnaturally so. Even the familiar creaks of the floorboards seemed absent. But the silence didn't bring peace. As the night deepened, the sound began again. A faint scratching from the walls, just barely audible. A soft whisper, like someone breathing just behind me. I felt it, the presence. It was there, somewhere in the house, watching, waiting. I knew it. And then came the footsteps. Slow and deliberate, just like the ones from under the bed. They were coming from the hallway, from the stairs, growing louder with each step. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was trapped, once again paralyzed by the terror that gripped me. I sat on the couch, eyes wide, fixed on the door, waiting for whatever was coming to show itself. The footsteps stopped right outside the room. For a moment, everything was still. And then the door opened. I didn't see anyone at first, but I could feel the presence, the cold, oppressive air that followed it. It was standing in the doorway, something tall and shadowed, obscured by the darkness. "Come closer," it whispered again. The voice was hollow, distorted, as if it wasn't coming from a living being. "I've been waiting for you." The room seemed to shrink around me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure in the doorway took a step forward, its shape becoming clearer in the dim light. Its face, if you could call it a face, was pale, featureless, just like the thing in the closet. Its eyes, if they were even eyes, glowed faintly, an unnatural, sickly yellow. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen. The thing was getting closer, its movements slow but deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. It was almost beside me now, close enough that I could feel the cold air it carried with it, like the chill of death itself. "Why?" I finally managed to croak, my voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out a long, thin arm toward me, its fingers clawing at the air. I could feel its presence before its hand even touched me, cold and heavy, like the weight of the world itself pressing down on my chest. And then, I heard it, the footsteps again. Only, they were no longer outside the room. They were inside. I turned my head, and for the first time, I saw it. The thing under the bed. It had crawled out, its thin, elongated body slithering across the floor like some kind of twisted creature. Its eyes, those same glowing eyes, were fixed on me, watching, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to stand. I had to escape, had to run. But as I moved, the figure in the doorway reached out and gripped my arm, its fingers cold as ice. I screamed, but no sound came out. In a panic, I yanked my arm free and bolted for the door. My legs felt like lead, but I pushed forward, crashing into the hallway, into the dark emptiness. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was outside, in the cold night air, gasping for breath. The house loomed behind me, silent now, but I knew better than to think it was over. I had escaped for now, but I knew that whatever had been waiting for me in that house wasn't finished. It was still there, and it would find me. It always found me. I could still hear it, just on the edge of my hearing, that soft whisper, those slow footsteps. It wasn't over. It would never be over. The days blurred into each other. I couldn't escape the memories of what I had seen in that house. The whispers, the footsteps, the eyes. They followed me wherever I went, like an unshakable shadow. I tried to move on, to convince myself that it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I couldn't stay away. I couldn't leave it behind. The house called to me in my dreams, its dark corners and cold silence beckoning, pulling me back. That night, I returned. I didn't want to. I should have left, should have walked away and never looked back. But I couldn't. The house had become a part of me, like a sickness in my bones that I couldn't shake. I stood outside, staring up at the broken windows and crumbling walls. It looked just as it always had, but now it felt different, more alive, more malevolent. I took a deep breath and stepped through the front door. The house was silent again, as it always was. Too silent. The air was thick, suffocating. Every step I took seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls and amplifying the weight of the silence. I made my way upstairs, my feet dragging, my mind numb. I knew what I had to do. I knew it wouldn't be over until I confronted it, until I faced whatever it was that had been waiting for me all this time. When I reached the bedroom, the door creaked open on its own. The room was just as I had left it, but the air felt colder now, the darkness thicker. And then I heard it. The faint scratching from under the bed. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding. The sound was unmistakable, the same as it had been that first night, when I had first felt its presence. The footsteps started again, slow and deliberate. I turned, my eyes scanning the room, searching for the source. But I already knew. It was under the bed. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The house felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in tighter and tighter. And then I saw them. The eyes. Two glowing yellow eyes, staring up at me from beneath the bed. They were more vivid now, more intense, as if they were drawing me in, pulling me closer to them. I wanted to look away. I wanted to run, to escape. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my gaze away from those eyes. The footsteps stopped. A low, guttural voice echoed from the darkness beneath the bed. "You should have left." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was something older, something darker. It felt like it came from the very walls of the house, from the depths of the earth itself. Why? Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. My body trembled, my knees weak beneath me. "Because you called me," the voice responded. "You awakened me." The floor beneath me groaned, and I stumbled backward, barely catching myself against the wall. The eyes seemed to grow larger, filling the entire space beneath the bed. I never meant to. I didn't want to. I stammered, but the words felt hollow. They didn't matter anymore. The thing beneath the bed began to rise. Slowly, impossibly, its form began to stretch up from the darkness, emerging from the shadow like a nightmare coming to life. Its body was twisted, elongated, its limbs far too long, its skin pale and slick. Its face was featureless, like a blank canvas, but its eyes, those eyes, they burned with an intensity that pierced through my soul. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the sheer presence of the thing. It stepped forward, its body twisting unnaturally as it moved, and I felt a sudden rush of cold, a wave of darkness that swallowed the room. My vision blurred, my thoughts fragmented. The thing reached for me. But just as its hand was about to touch me, I snapped out of the trance. I bolted for the door, my heart racing, my mind screaming for me to escape. I ran down the stairs, through the hallway, and out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running. I didn't look back. But I could hear it. The footsteps. The whispers. They were following me, getting closer with every step. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing on the side of the road, gasping for breath. I looked up at the sky, the stars blurry through my tears. The house loomed in the distance, but I couldn't go back. It wasn't over. It never would be. The thing had followed me. It would always follow me, waiting, watching. And I knew, deep down, that there was nowhere I could hide. Not from it. Not from what I had awakened. Have you ever been somewhere so familiar, yet sensed something was wrong, something hidden just out of sight? That was the feeling I had every day at my office building. I had worked there for over a year, and I knew it like the back of my hand, every hallway, every corner, every elevator button. But there was one thing that never made sense, a floor that didn't exist. It wasn't in the blueprints, not on any of the directories in the lobby, and yet the elevator seemed to stop there sometimes. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was imagining things. I had pressed the button for the 5th floor, but the elevator didn't stop on the usual 2nd or 3rd floors. It passed them all, only halting when the doors opened onto a dimly lit hallway I had never seen before. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was some kind of glitch, a malfunction. I stepped off the elevator, looking around in confusion. The hall was narrow and almost claustrophobic, the walls painted a dull shade of gray, and the lights flickered above me. Everything about it was wrong, nothing about the place fit the rest of the building. The floor smelled faintly of something old, something stale. But before I could gather my thoughts, the elevator doors closed behind me, and it descended without a sound, leaving me in a silence that seemed too thick, too still. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers twitching to press the elevator button again, but there was no use. I was already here, in a place that shouldn't exist. Curiosity tugged at me. I walked down the hall, trying to ignore the hairs standing up on the back of my neck. The place was empty, no desks, no office doors. Just barren, cold space that stretched out before me. There was a faint hum, as though the air conditioning was on, but no other sound. I glanced at the walls, expecting to see the familiar signs of the office floors, department names, floor numbers, but there was nothing. I turned the corner at the end of the hall, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. At the end of the hallway stood a door. It wasn't locked. I reached for the handle without thinking, and it creaked open. Inside was another empty room, almost identical to the hallway, dim lights, unremarkable walls. But there was something strange about the air in here, something colder. I should have left. I knew that. But something kept me moving forward. There was a lingering sensation in the room, something tugging at the edge of my consciousness. It was as if I was being drawn in, as if the place wanted me to stay. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere deep within the room, somewhere behind the walls. "Help me." The voice was low, raspy, almost pleading. It sent a chill down my spine, and I froze in place. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat on my palms, my breathing quickening. I should have left then, but the curiosity was too strong. I couldn't explain it, but I had to know. I had to find out what was going on. I moved closer to the far wall, my eyes scanning for any sign of what could have caused the voice. And then I saw it, a crack in the wall, a thin gap that seemed out of place. My hand reached out before I could stop it, pushing against the cold surface. The wall shifted. It wasn't a crack. It was a door. It opened with a loud, grating sound, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I should have stopped. I should have turned around and left. But I couldn't. I stepped forward, my legs moving of their own accord, my mind telling me this was a mistake, but my body ignoring the warning. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the darkness swallowing the light from above. The temperature dropped with every step, and the silence was so thick I could hear the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I reached the bottom of the stairs, and the smell hit me, moldy, musty, like a basement that had been sealed for years. The room ahead of me was darker than the hallway above, the faintest hint of light coming from a small crack in the ceiling. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. The room was vast, the walls stretching far beyond what I could see. And in the middle of the room, there was a table. A long wooden table covered in dust with old papers scattered across it. And on the walls, strange symbols, drawings that I couldn't make sense of. But what caught my attention the most was the sound. The whispering was louder now, almost like a chorus, overlapping and tangled, coming from every direction at once. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was dozens. Help me. Get out. Don't look. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was frozen, my legs rooted to the floor. And then, in the far corner of the room, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, flickering at the edge of my vision, but then it came closer. Slowly. Unnaturally. I could feel its presence, a coldness that swept through the room like a storm. And then, I saw it. A figure. Tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. It was standing there, watching me, its mouth moving as if it was trying to speak, but no words came out. The whispering grew louder, the voices all merging together into a maddening cacophony. I couldn't take it anymore. My legs gave way, and I fell to the floor, gasping for air. I had to get out. But as I scrambled to my feet, the figure moved again, its long, thin fingers reaching out toward me. And then everything went black. I awoke on the cold floor, the darkness pressing in from all sides. My head throbbed, and my heart raced as if it were about to burst. I pushed myself up, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The figure, the shadow, had it been real? My mind was struggling to piece things together. I was no longer in the vast room with the strange symbols. No, I was somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't recognize. I looked around, but all I could see was an endless hallway, stretching far beyond the reach of the weak light above me. The walls were coated in peeling paint, the air heavy with the stench of mildew and decay. It felt wrong. The building I knew so well, the one I had worked in for months, wasn't like this. There were no corridors like this, no abandoned hallways. I tried to push myself to my feet, but my legs were unsteady, like they no longer wanted to carry me. My thoughts were fragmented, unable to form anything coherent. The whispering voices hadn't stopped. They surrounded me now, faint, distant, but somehow always present. Get out, one of them hissed. It's not too late, another whispered urgently. They felt like a part of the walls, as if the very structure of the building was alive, watching me, judging me. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. The air in this place was thick, suffocating, and the light flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. I reached for the nearest door, the one closest to me, desperate for some way out. It creaked as I pushed it open, revealing yet another room, a room that seemed just as empty as the others, but this one felt different. The silence in here was deafening. There were no voices, no whispers. Just an overwhelming stillness. The walls were covered in what looked like old, faded photographs, each one depicting scenes from different times, different places. Faces I didn't recognize stared back at me, their expressions hollow, their eyes dark and empty. I couldn't look away. My fingers trembled as they brushed over the photos, each one more unsettling than the last. A man standing in front of a building, his face half turned away. A woman staring at the camera, her mouth slightly open, as though she was about to speak, but no sound came. Children playing in a yard, but their eyes were unnaturally large, too wide. The pictures seemed to warp as I stared at them, their edges blurring and shifting in the dim light. A cold draft swept through the room, and I jerked my head up, startled. The door had closed behind me without me noticing, and now the room felt even colder, the temperature dropping sharply. I turned quickly, but the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, as though it had fused with the frame, but would warped and bent as if something had been pushing against it from the other side. My panic surged. I was trapped. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in short gasps, and that's when I saw it. On the far side of the room, the corner was darker than the rest, deeper than the shadows. There, barely visible in the gloom, was a figure. A person, or something that looked like one. Tall, too tall, its shape distorted in ways that made it hard to look it directly. It stood perfectly still, watching me with eyes that seemed to absorb the light, its face hidden in the darkness. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. It was like something was holding me in place, like the air itself was weighing me down. The figure moved, slowly, with a grace that shouldn't belong to something so unnatural. It stepped forward, and the room seemed to stretch with it, the space growing impossibly large. The photographs on the walls blurred into one, becoming an abstract mass of faces, eyes, and mouths that twisted and turned in a sickening, hypnotic pattern. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It was deeper, darker, like 1,000 whispers blending together into one, filling my mind with cold, empty thoughts. "Why are you here?" it asked, its voice echoing in my skull. "Why did you open the door?" I tried to speak, to tell it I didn't know, that I had no idea what was happening. But my mouth was dry, my tongue thick with fear. I couldn't make a sound. The figure moved closer, its steps impossibly slow, as though savoring every moment of my terror. I could feel it now, a weight pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. "You should have stayed away," it whispered again. "But now, you've seen it. You've opened the door." The walls seemed to close in, the room shrinking, the air thickening. I could see its face now, or rather, its lack of a face. Where there should have been features, there was only smooth, featureless skin, an endless expanse of pale flesh that seemed to ripple as if it were alive. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, louder than the whispers, louder than anything else in the room. I turned, frantic, and tried to pull the door open again, but it remained locked tight. I couldn't get out. And then, the figure reached out for me, its long, thin fingers stretching toward my face. The air turned icy cold, and I felt a wave of dread so powerful it almost made me collapse to the floor. My legs were shaking, my mind slipping into panic. The door gave way with a sudden crack, and I stumbled back, barely able to breathe as I rushed through it. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran, not caring where I was going, my footsteps echoing through the hallways as I desperately tried to find my way back to something familiar. The building was shifting around me, the walls twisting and bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. And then, I found myself back at the elevator. I pressed the button with trembling fingers, desperate to leave, desperate to escape. The doors slid open, and I stepped inside, panting, my heart racing. But as the elevator began to ascend, I realized something. The floor numbers didn't match up. The numbers flickered as the elevator moved, and I saw the one I dreaded most. The disappeared floor. It was coming for me again. The elevator was too quiet. I could hear the hum of the cables, the soft creak of the metal as it ascended, but nothing else. I stood there, my heart thumping in my chest, my breath shallow, trying to calm myself. But no matter how much I willed it, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I wasn't just trapped in this building anymore. The building was in me, its darkness, its whispers, its endless spaces, all were inside my head. The elevator slowed. I looked up, my eyes flicking nervously to the floor display. The numbers started to blink, each one fading in and out, shifting like they were caught between two different realities. It stopped. For a brief moment, I thought it was just a glitch. Maybe I had pressed the wrong button. But when I looked at the floor number, I knew what it was. The door slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing a hallway that felt wrong. Familiar, but wrong. The same dim light flickered overhead, casting long, stretched shadows that seemed to move even when there was no one around. The walls, once pristine, now looked damp and chipped, as if time had started to erode the building itself. I should have turned around. I should have pressed the button again and made the elevator take me anywhere but here. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, too heavy to lift. The weight of the place, the weight of the voices, was pressing against me, suffocating me, urging me to step out. I stepped into the hallway. The elevator doors closed behind me, sealing me in with the silence, and I found myself walking down a corridor I had never seen before. The sound of my footsteps seemed amplified, echoing back to me like a warning. With each step, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. I walked slowly, my fingers brushing against the walls as if expecting something to jump out at me. Each flicker of the overhead light made my stomach twist with unease. I could feel something in the air, something that wasn't right, that wasn't natural. The whispers were back, but this time they weren't faint. They were louder, closer, almost like they were coming from the walls themselves. From the very foundation of the building. Help us. Why did you come back? Leave now. I tried to ignore them, tried to block out the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest. I had to find an exit. I had to leave. But as I walked further into the hallway, I saw something that froze me in place. At the end of the corridor was a door, but it wasn't like the others. It was bigger, old, and heavy, with intricate carvings around the edges that I didn't recognize. It stood out against the otherwise plain walls, like a scar, something that didn't belong. Without thinking, I moved toward it. My hand reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth wood. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath as I touched the handle, almost as if the building was waiting for me to open it. And I did. The door creaked open, revealing another room. The temperature inside was frigid, the air thick and heavy. The light inside was dim, casting long, eerie shadows. The room was large, bigger than any room I had seen in the building, and it was filled with old, broken furniture, chairs overturned, dusty tables, books scattered across the floor. But it wasn't the room that made my blood run cold. It was what was in it. In the far corner of the room, near the window, was the figure. The same tall, gaunt shape I had seen before. It was standing motionless, its face obscured by shadows. The moment I saw it, a chill ran down my spine, and the air around me seemed to thicken. I couldn't breathe. My limbs felt paralyzed, my mind screaming for me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure slowly turned its head toward me, and I saw its face, or what was left of it. It wasn't human. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin, stretched tight over its skull like a mask. It was featureless, but somehow I knew it was looking at me. Watching me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering voices, now more like a chorus of hundreds of people, filled my mind, drowning out all other sound. You shouldn't have come back, the figure said, its voice not a sound but a presence, pressing on me from all sides. It was the same voice that had spoken to me before, only now it was clearer, louder. "You've opened the door. Now, there's no turning back." I tried to move, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, as though the very floor had become a part of me. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. The whispers around me became frantic, distorted, like the building itself was trying to speak, to warn me, to trap me. And then, in the corner of my eye, something shifted. A door. Another door, barely visible in the shadows. It hadn't been there before, but now it was, standing at the opposite end of the room, beckoning me. Without thinking, I broke free from my paralysis and ran toward it. I didn't look back, didn't stop to question why it was there, why I was running. All I knew was that I had to escape, had to leave this place, whatever it was. But as my hand touched the door, it slammed shut in front of me, trapping me inside. I pulled at the handle, desperate, my heart racing. The whispers grew louder, louder than ever, echoing through the room like 1,000 trapped souls. And then, a voice. The voice. "Leave," it said, clear and unmistakable. "Or you'll become one of us." I turned to face the figure, but it was gone. The room, the hallway, the building, it all felt wrong. And then I realized I had never left. This place was a part of me now. I wasn't sure how long I had been standing there, trapped in that room, staring at the door. The whispers had faded slightly, but they were still present, their presence crawling beneath my skin, gnawing at my thoughts. I couldn't think clearly anymore. Everything felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the building itself was breathing in rhythm with me, constricting with every inhale, releasing a slow, heavy exhale with each breath I took. I turned back to the door I had tried to open, but now it was locked. My hand touched the cold metal handle, but it didn't budge. I pulled harder, but the door wouldn't yield. And then I realized something else. The room had changed. The walls, which had once been bare, now seemed to be closing in. The space had shrunk, the ceiling lower, the corners darker. The furniture, broken chairs, overturned tables, shattered glass, was shifting. The movement was subtle at first, but it was there. The objects weren't static anymore. They were alive, slowly twisting and reshaping like the fabric of the room itself. I backed away from the door, my pulse quickening. A sudden sense of panic washed over me. It was like I was being swallowed by the building, absorbed by the very walls that had once seemed familiar. I could feel the floor beneath me tremble, a vibration that was almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to find a way back. But where was the way back? And then it hit me. I wasn't alone. I wasn't just trapped in this room. I had been trapped in the building itself. It wasn't just a place, it was a prison, a maze, and it was feeding off me, off my fear. The walls, the floors, the doors, everything was part of this endless loop. There was no escape. The door at the far end of the room had opened. I hadn't heard it, but it was there, standing wide, a dark portal to the unknown. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, but I knew I had no choice but to step toward it. It was my only way out, even if I didn't understand what was happening. The moment I stepped through that door, everything changed again. The hallway on the other side was the same, yet different. It was as if I had stepped back into the beginning, back to where it had all started. The lights flickered above me, casting harsh shadows along the walls. The whispers returned, louder now, all around me. There was no sound of footsteps this time, only the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, echoing through the hallway. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if there was a way out anymore. But I had to keep moving. I had to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening, that could help me break free from this cycle. The floor felt uneven beneath my feet, the walls curving in on themselves. I couldn't trust what I was seeing anymore. The hallway stretched on for what felt like miles, but I knew it was an illusion. The building was playing tricks on me, bending space, distorting time. And then I saw it. The elevator. It was sitting there at the end of the hall, its doors wide open, as if it had been waiting for me all along. A flicker of hope surged through me. Maybe this time I could escape. Maybe the elevator would take me back to the real world, back to safety. I rushed toward it, but as I drew closer, the door slid shut. I froze. The lights inside flickered once, then twice, as if mocking me. A sudden realization hit me. This was the same elevator I had ridden before. The same one that had taken me to the mysterious floor. I pressed the button frantically, but nothing happened. The doors remained sealed, and the air grew heavier, thicker. I turned around, panic flooding through me. The hallway was no longer familiar. It was twisting, changing, warping around me. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows moving in sync with my every step. The whispering voices had become louder, more insistent. They were everywhere now, filling my head with their hollow, mocking laughter. "You can never leave," they chanted. "You've already seen too much. This is where you belong now." The sound of my own breath was drowned out by their voices. The room, the hallway, the elevator, they were all part of it, part of the nightmare that I couldn't wake from. I couldn't escape. I couldn't even tell what was real anymore. I stumbled backward, my eyes frantically searching for an exit, but there was nothing. Just walls. Just shadows. And that door, the one at the end of the hallway, always the same. Always waiting for me. I had no choice. I had to go through it. I reached for the door, my hand trembling. The moment my fingers touched the handle, I felt it again. The presence. The same feeling that had been there from the beginning. Something was watching me, something was waiting. I opened the door. The room beyond it was familiar, too familiar. The same photographs, the same furniture, the same figure in the corner. It was all the same, like the cycle had never ended. The whispers began again, their voices rising in crescendo as the figure stepped closer, its form distorting, shifting, becoming something even more horrifying than before. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't hide. I had already lost. I had become a part of the loop. And there was no way out. I was no longer sure where the hallway ended and where the room began. The boundaries had melted away, like a dream slowly disintegrating into a nightmare. Everything was spinning, blurring into itself, endlessly folding in on itself, like the very fabric of reality was unraveling. I looked back toward the door I had just come through, but it was already gone, vanished into the darkness. The hallway stretched out before me, infinite and hollow, with no trace of the real world left. There were no windows, no sense of time, no familiar sights. Just endless walls and flickering lights. I was caught in this place. The whispers had become deafening, a cacophony of voices that filled the space, that filled my mind. They were speaking all at once, calling to me, mocking me. Their words were no longer just warnings. They had become demands. Stay, they urged. You belong here. I could hear the figure's footsteps now, heavy and slow. They echoed through the hall, deliberate, as if it was savoring each step it took toward me. Its presence was unbearable. I could feel it in my bones, crawling under my skin. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I could only stand there, frozen, paralyzed by a force stronger than anything I had ever known. It was standing in front of me now. I looked up, my heart pounding. The figure loomed over me, its shape stretching impossibly tall. Its face, if it could be called a face, was still smooth and featureless, a blank slate, an absence of humanity. I couldn't look away from it, but I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was like my mind refused to process the sheer horror of it. The air around me grew colder, colder than it had ever been before. I felt the chill seep into my bones, into my very soul. The walls were closing in. The space was shrinking, and there was no escape. The whispers grew louder, the voices now chanting in unison. You've seen the truth, they said. There's no going back. The figure reached out for me, its hands long and thin, impossibly so, like spider legs stretching toward me, toward my neck. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Join us, it hissed. You'll never leave. It was not just a voice. It was a presence, pushing its way into my mind, wrapping itself around my thoughts, swallowing everything whole. And then, just as its fingers brushed against my skin, I felt a sudden shift, like the world was turning on its axis. The hallway, the figure, the whispers, they all flickered, like images on a screen that were being disrupted by static. For a split second, I saw something else. A door. A real door. Not the endless hallway. Not the figure. A door that led to something else. Somewhere else. A place where I had been before. The real world. I lunged toward it, my body moving of its own accord. I didn't think. I just ran, my legs shaking, my heart hammering in my chest. The door was right there. I could see it now, just a few feet away. The figure behind me screamed, its voice splitting the air like a crack of thunder, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to make it through. I slammed my hand against the door handle, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. I didn't know if I was still in the building, if I was still dreaming, if I had gone mad. But then, the door opened. Light flooded through, pure and bright, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe again. The building, the hall, the whispers, the figure vanished into the light, fading away like a bad memory. I was standing in a hallway. A real hallway. A normal hallway. I looked around. I was back in the office building. The same place I had started. The walls were clean. The elevator was just ahead, unmoving, calm. There was no flickering light. No distorted space. I had made it. Or so I thought. I stood there, catching my breath, and then it hit me. The sound. The unmistakable sound. The whispering. It was coming from behind me. I turned around slowly. The door, the one I had just opened, was still there, standing wide open. But this time, it wasn't empty. Inside, the same figure was standing, just as before. It wasn't moving. It was waiting. Waiting for me. I tried to take a step back, but my legs wouldn't move. My heart stopped. I realized something terrifying. There was no escaping. I had never left. The hallway, the room, the building, it had never stopped. I had only been circling the same place over and over again. The loop had taken me. And now, I was part of it. I could feel the walls closing in again. The whispering voices filled my ears, their words becoming clearer. "Welcome back," they whispered. "This is your home now." I screamed, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, my mind blank. And then, in the distance, I heard the elevator. The same elevator that had always been waiting. I realized then that the loop would never end. Not for me. I had become the building's newest prisoner. And this place would never let me go. It all began with a single letter. I had just moved into my new house, a quiet, out-of-the-way place in a neighborhood that seemed as if it had been forgotten by time. The house itself was old, too old, perhaps, and came with all the usual creaks and groans of a place built long before my parents were born. But I liked it. It felt safe, secluded, and I needed the peace. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping coffee on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning when I heard the soft, familiar sound of the mail slot clinking open. I didn't think much of it, as the mail usually came around this time, but then the letter caught my attention. It was different from the usual bills and advertisements. It was addressed to me, of course, but the name on the envelope wasn't mine. The handwriting was neat, almost too perfect. The ink was dark, almost black, and the name was written in a way that made my stomach churn, Alice Miller. It didn't ring a bell, but there was something odd about the name. Something unsettling. I felt a strange shiver run down my spine as I turned the envelope over, my hand shaking slightly. There was no return address. I opened it carefully, almost reverently, as if the paper might tear with the slightest wrong move. Inside was a simple letter, typed in a font that looked both modern and out of place at the same time. It read, "Please, you have to help me. I am trapped in this place." It was my husband. He did it. The fire was not an accident. The letter was signed in the same neat handwriting, Alice Miller. I felt my pulse quicken. The words were jumbled, disjointed, as if the writer was desperate. I ran my fingers over the paper, feeling an odd chill creep over me. It didn't make sense. Who was Alice Miller? What fire? My mind raced, but before I could gather my thoughts, I heard the unmistakable sound of the mail slot again. I stood up and moved toward the door, heart pounding in my chest. Another letter. The same handwriting, the same perfect ink. Another name. This time, the letter was addressed to someone named James Peterson. I froze. My stomach churned again. I didn't know a James Peterson, but the letter was real. It was here, in my hands. I opened it, and this time the message was clear, but even more disturbing than the last. "Please, you have to stop him. He will hurt her. He wants to finish what he started." The letter was signed, just like the last one, with that strange, almost flawless handwriting, James Peterson. I couldn't understand it. How was this possible? I had never heard of these people, yet here they were, writing to me. It was as though I was connected to their past in some way I couldn't understand. And the worst part was, as I read the letters, I realized that they weren't just strange, they were terrifying. These people, these names, were all dead. I didn't know what to do with this information. My hands trembled as I sat back down at the kitchen table, trying to process everything. I searched online for any information on Alice Miller, James Peterson, and the fires they spoke of. But there was nothing, no records, no obituaries, nothing. They didn't exist in the modern world. And yet, their letters kept coming. Every day, without fail. Each time the handwriting was flawless, each name unknown, but each request more desperate than the last. I could feel my mind slowly unraveling. Was it possible? Could the dead truly communicate with the living? Were these just twisted pranks? Or was there something darker, something far more sinister going on? The letters were beginning to haunt me. They didn't just arrive by mail. Sometimes I'd hear them rustling in the dead of night. They'd slide across the floor to my doorstep, just under the door, as though they were being pushed by unseen hands. There were times I would wake in the middle of the night, staring at the pile of letters on the kitchen table, their names staring back at me like silent, accusing eyes. I had to find out who they were, what they wanted, how they knew my address, my name, my life. And maybe, just maybe, I would learn the truth about their deaths. The truth that they so desperately wanted to tell me. The next letter came early in the morning. I hadn't slept much, the heavy weight of those previous letters still pressing on my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that I was being pulled into something I wasn't prepared for. This time, the letter was addressed to someone named Henry Walters. It looked identical to the others, the same precise handwriting, the same dark ink, the same unnerving lack of a return address. I hesitated before opening it, as though I might find something that I couldn't escape. But my curiosity won out. I carefully tore open the envelope. He didn't mean to kill her. Please, you have to tell them the truth. Tell them it wasn't me. It was the one who came before. He's still here. I felt the room grow colder as I read those words. It was like an invisible hand had brushed against the back of my neck. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. Who are these people? I whispered to myself, trying to steady my trembling hands. I spent hours that morning searching for any trace of Henry Walters, hoping against hope that this would all just be some twisted joke. I combed through online obituaries, local news archives, and genealogy sites, trying to find any connection to this name. But there was nothing, no record, no mention of him. It was as though he had never existed. The frustration gnawed at me, but something else was beginning to settle in, something deeper, something colder. This wasn't just about missing people. This was about something far darker. These names, they were part of a story that I was now involved in, whether I wanted to be or not. That afternoon, I visited the local library, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain these letters. The old librarian, Mrs. Greaves, gave me a strange look when I asked about Henry Walters. Her eyes narrowed, her fingers brushing over the dusty records on the shelves, but when I mentioned the names from the letters, her face paled. You shouldn't go looking for things you don't understand, she warned softly, her voice trembling. Some doors should never be opened. I asked her again about Henry Walters, but she wouldn't respond. Instead, she shuffled me out of the library, her hands trembling as she locked the door behind me. That night, another letter arrived. This one was addressed to Thomas Reed. I'm sorry. I couldn't stop him. He's still alive. He's coming for you. I stared at the letter for a long time. It wasn't just the words anymore, it was the feeling that came with them. An overwhelming sense of dread. I began to wonder if these people were truly dead, or if they were somehow still here, in the house, watching me. Something had happened in the past, a tragedy, an event that had trapped these souls in a state of unrest. And somehow, they had found me. The silence in my house that night was unbearable. The letters kept coming, each one adding more pieces to a puzzle I didn't want to solve. Each name, each message, pulled me deeper into something I didn't understand. But there was one letter I hadn't yet opened. The envelope was heavier than the others, and the handwriting looked different, familiar, almost. I almost didn't want to look at it, but I knew I had to. I tore it open. I am sorry. I didn't know what I was doing. He's here. He's going to finish what he started. Please don't let him find you. The name at the bottom of the letter was the one that sent a chill through my entire body. Alice Miller. The same name as the first letter. I stared at the words, my heart racing. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out who these people were, what they wanted, why they had chosen me. I went back to the library the next day, determined to get answers. Mrs. Greaves was there, watching me closely from behind her desk. But I didn't care. I needed to know. This time, I was not leaving until I had the truth. As I scanned the old newspaper archives, something caught my eye. A headline that seemed to call to me like it had been waiting for me all along. Fire claims the lives of Alice Miller and James Peterson, suspicious circumstances. I froze. The article was from decades ago, detailing a mysterious fire that had consumed a small house on the outskirts of town. Alice Miller and James Peterson were listed as the victims. But the most chilling part was the line at the end of the article. Authorities are still investigating the cause of the fire, but rumors have begun to surface about a third person. Someone who disappeared that night. The article didn't name the third person, but I knew what I had to do next. I had to find out who had vanished and why these letters were coming to me. The chilling discovery about the third person in the fire lingered in my mind long after I left the library. The name Alice Miller kept echoing in my thoughts, along with the eerie warning she had written, "He's here. He's going to finish what he started." Who was the third person? Why had they vanished without a trace? What did it all have to do with me? I couldn't sleep that night, the weight of the unanswered questions pressing on my chest. The house felt colder than usual, the silence more oppressive. It was as if something was watching me, waiting. The letters had been arriving daily, each one more disturbing than the last. I could feel the tension building, like a storm on the horizon. But no matter how many times I searched, there were no answers to be found. I had to know more about the fire, more about the third person. The only place left to go was the local police records. If the fire had been as suspicious as the article implied, surely there must have been some sort of investigation, some record of the missing person. The next day, I went to the town's police station. The building was old, its windows slightly grimy, as if it hadn't seen much change in years. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale paper and dust. A woman at the desk, who looked like she'd been there for decades, greeted me with a weary smile. "I need information about a fire," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It happened decades ago, Alice Miller and James Peterson, and a third person who disappeared. "Do you have anything on it?" The woman's face instantly shifted, her smile fading. She glanced at me as if she was trying to decide whether to trust me or not. "You should leave it alone," she said, her voice low. Some things are better left forgotten. I pressed on, my desperation growing. I have to know. Please, it's important. She hesitated for a long moment before finally nodding. I'll see what I can do. She led me to a back room, a small, dimly lit office that smelled faintly of old paper and ink. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, their drawers filled with decades of records. After a few minutes, she pulled out a file that seemed to be from a different time, yellow paper, creases at the edges, and a thick layer of dust covering the surface. This is the file you're looking for, she said, placing the folder on the table in front of me. But be careful with it. Some things are better left in the past. I opened the file slowly, my fingers trembling. Inside were the usual reports, fire damage assessments, witness statements, and the like. But what stood out was a handwritten note on a scrap of paper near the back of the file. It was a brief statement from one of the firefighters who had responded to the scene. I swear I saw someone standing in the doorway just before the fire started. They looked like a man, but there was something off about him. His face. I couldn't see it. I thought he was one of the victims, but when we went inside, he was gone. I reread the note several times. A man? But who? And why was he never mentioned in the official report? I turned the page, my heart pounding in my chest. The next page held a name that sent chills down my spine. Thomas Reed. The same name as one of the letters. This was no coincidence. The man who had vanished the night of the fire had the same name as someone who had been writing to me. I had to find out more about Thomas Reed. I had to know who he was, why he had disappeared, and what his connection was to Alice and James. I left the police station, my mind racing with thoughts and questions. I drove back to my house in a daze, the streets blurring around me. The house was waiting for me, its dark windows staring back as if it knew what I had uncovered. That night, another letter arrived. It was addressed to me, but the handwriting was different this time. It was less neat, more frantic. I never meant for this to happen. I was just trying to warn you. Thomas Reed is still here. He's the one who caused the fire. And now he's coming for you. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The letters were becoming more urgent, more frantic. But now I had a name that connected everything. Thomas Reed. I had to find him. I had to confront whatever it was that was hunting me, that was tied to these people and their deaths. But the question was, where was he? And how could I stop him? As the hours dragged on and the night deepened, I realized that whatever was happening wasn't just about the past. It was happening now. Thomas Reed wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was here. And I was his next target. The morning after I received the latest letter, I felt like I was walking through a fog. The weight of the situation pressed on me harder than ever before. Each letter was like a thread in a tapestry I couldn't fully comprehend, yet, somehow, I knew I was nearing the end of it. Thomas Reed. Alice Miller. James Peterson. Their names kept swirling in my mind like an unholy chant, each one tied to something darker than death itself. I couldn't stop thinking about that firefighter's note in the file. I swear I saw someone standing in the doorway just before the fire started. And then the name. Thomas Reed. The letter I had received last night, he's coming for you, told me everything I needed to know. Whoever Thomas Reed was, he was no longer just a figure from the past. He was here. And his purpose was clear. I spent the rest of the morning trying to find out more about him. The internet had nothing on Thomas Reed, and the police file had been as bare as it could be. All I had were these cryptic letters, each one pushing me further into the depths of something I couldn't explain. Around noon, as I sat in my kitchen trying to piece together everything, I heard a noise from upstairs. It was faint at first, barely audible. The creaking of floorboards. Someone was walking around up there. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound, but the creaking continued. It was coming from the attic. I had never really thought much about the attic. It was just a dusty, forgotten space I rarely ventured into. But now, the idea of what or who might be up there filled me with dread. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way upstairs, my footsteps cautious and deliberate. The house seemed unnaturally quiet, the air still, as if holding its breath. I reached the attic door and hesitated. What was I even looking for? What had I hoped to find? I opened the door and shone the flashlight inside. The attic was exactly as I remembered it, empty, filled with old boxes and forgotten furniture. But as my light swept across the room, I froze. There, in the far corner, was a figure. A man. His back was to me, his face hidden in shadow. He was standing perfectly still, as though he had been waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat. Was this Thomas Reed? Was he finally here, standing in my house? I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear. Then, without turning around, the figure spoke in a voice that made my skin crawl. You shouldn't have come looking. The words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead. You can't escape it, the man continued. You're already part of it. And now, you'll never be free. I had no idea how to respond. What was happening? Who was this man? Was this Thomas Reed? And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows of the attic. I heard nothing after that. Not a sound. I stood there, frozen for what felt like hours, but when I finally gathered the courage to move, I found the attic empty. No man. No figure. Just the same old dust and forgotten memories. I didn't know what to think. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind, or had I actually seen him? All I knew for certain was that I wasn't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. I rushed back downstairs, my heart still racing. The house felt colder now, the walls pressing in on me. I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed to get away, to clear my mind. I grabbed my coat and rushed out the door, not knowing where I was going, just needing to escape. I drove aimlessly through the streets, the headlights of my car cutting through the dark, empty roads. But no matter how far I drove, the feeling of being hunted never left. It was as though Thomas Reed was always one step behind me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Eventually, I found myself back at the library. I hadn't meant to come here, but something pulled me inside. The air was thick with the smell of old books and dust. Mrs. Greaves was behind the counter again, her eyes following me as I walked in. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said softly, her voice laced with concern. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I wasn't sure if I had seen a ghost or if I was simply losing my grip on reality. I needed answers, answers that only the library could provide. I spent the next few hours combing through every piece of information I could find on Thomas Reed, Alice Miller, James Peterson, and the fire. But there was nothing. No new clues. Nothing to explain what was happening to me. It wasn't until I was about to leave that I noticed something odd. Tucked away in a corner, hidden under a pile of old newspapers, was a book, small, old, and bound in dark leather. It looked out of place, like it had been left there on purpose. I pulled it out, dusting it off. On the cover, in faded gold lettering, were the words "The Forgotten Ones." I opened the book to the first page, and immediately I knew something was wrong. It was a record of names of people who had died under mysterious circumstances, their deaths unexplained. And as I read through the list, my breath caught. There, in the middle of the page, was the name I had been searching for. Thomas Reed. But what was even more disturbing was the note written next to his name. It was written in the same frantic handwriting from the letters. "He isn't dead. Not yet." I couldn't believe what I had just read. My hands trembled as I held the book, staring at the words that felt like a final warning. He isn't dead. Not yet. What did that even mean? How could Thomas Reed still be alive, even though the police had confirmed his death decades ago? I slammed the book shut, but the eerie silence of the library made it feel like the world had stopped moving. I could hear nothing but my own shallow breathing. My head was spinning, each question leading to another, none of them offering any answers. I turned toward the door, the weight of the situation sinking in. As I made my way out of the library, I noticed Mrs. Greaves was watching me, her face filled with concern, but also something else. Something I couldn't quite place. Her eyes flickered toward the book I had just found, and I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. "You found it," she said quietly. I didn't know how to respond. The words wouldn't come out. I had 1,000 questions, but all I could manage was a faint nod. "Be careful," she added. "You've already uncovered too much. There are things better left unknown." The warning was there, plain and simple. But it was too late. I had already gone too far, and there was no turning back now. I walked out of the library and into the cold night air, my mind racing. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't stay at my house. The feeling that something, or someone, was watching me had grown unbearable. My phone vibrated in my pocket, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message. I unlocked the screen and froze. The text was simple, but it made my blood run cold. "I told you to stop looking. You should have listened." The sender's name was unknown, just a string of numbers. I quickly turned off my phone, my heart hammering in my chest. Who could have sent that? Was it Thomas Reed himself? Was he really still out there, watching me, threatening me? I didn't know what to do. I was running out of options. The only thing left was to confront whatever was coming, even though I had no idea what that meant. I drove home, the familiar streets feeling foreign under the dim streetlights. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something strange. The house, which had felt so imposing before, now seemed different. As if something had changed. I went inside, locking the door behind me. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was here with me, hidden in the shadows. The moment I stepped into the living room, I saw it, an envelope, lying on the coffee table. It was addressed to me, written in the same handwriting from the letters. I walked slowly toward it, dread pooling in my stomach. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. The envelope was heavier than it should have been. I opened it, and inside was a single sheet of paper. I read the words aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. I told you not to look, but now you've seen too much. There's no escaping it. You're part of it now. You're one of us. The letter was signed with a name I had come to dread, Thomas Reed. I dropped the letter, my heart racing. The walls of the house seemed to close in on me, the air thick with a suffocating sense of dread. I knew, without a doubt, that I was being drawn into something far beyond my understanding. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. It came from upstairs. I froze. The sound was unmistakable, the sound of something or someone falling. I didn't want to go up there. I didn't want to confront whatever was waiting for me. But I knew I had no choice. Slowly, I ascended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing in from all sides. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw it. The door to the attic was wide open. I hadn't left it like that. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I didn't want to look, but my body moved on its own, as if some invisible force was guiding me. I stepped into the attic, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the room. The shadows seemed to shift and move, taking on strange, unnatural shapes. And then, there it was. A figure standing in the corner of the room. It was Thomas Reed, his face hidden in shadow, just as it had been before. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were other figures, standing in the corners of the room, their faces indistinguishable from one another. They were all watching me, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. The air was thick with an oppressive force, like something was holding me in place. Thomas Reed took a step toward me, his voice cold and distant. You shouldn't have come back. But now, you're one of us. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. It felt like I was being pulled into the darkness, like the house itself was swallowing me whole. And then, everything went black. Have you ever heard a story so strange that it made you question whether it was real or just a product of imagination? In my neighborhood, there's a legend about a man who appears only on rainy nights. They say he wears a dark coat, his face hidden in shadow, and he's always seen walking alone, like he's searching for something or someone. I used to laugh at those stories. I thought they were just idle gossip, a way for people to entertain themselves on dreary evenings. But then, one night, something happened that changed my perspective forever. It was a stormy evening. The kind of night where the rain fell in sheets and the wind howled like a living thing. I sat by my window, wrapped in a blanket, trying to ignore the howling wind as it rattled the glass. I was used to nights like this, nothing more than a typical winter storm. But then, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps a shadow cast by the trees swaying outside. But no! There, just across the street, stood a figure in the rain. A tall man, his face obscured by the hood of his dark coat. His posture was stiff, almost unnatural, and he was standing still, as if waiting. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The figure was still there, unmoving, staring into the dark street. My heart began to race. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew, deep down, that something was wrong. I had heard the stories. I had laughed at them, dismissed them as nonsense. But in that moment, I wasn't so sure anymore. I tried to look away, tried to convince myself it was just someone else caught in the storm, someone who had nowhere to go. But I couldn't. Something about the way he stood there, motionless, felt wrong. Like he didn't belong in this world. I watched him for what felt like an eternity, unable to move or look away. The street lamp above flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced around him, making it hard to see him clearly. But I could feel his presence, like he was drawing closer with each passing second. Then, something shifted. The figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, he started walking toward my house, his footsteps barely audible in the roaring wind. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man walked with an eerie calmness, his steps measured and sure. He was heading straight for my house. I could see him getting closer with each passing moment, the silhouette of his dark coat growing larger, more defined. My pulse raced. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? Should I hide? I was paralyzed, unable to move or speak. I watched him as he reached the base of my porch steps. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The storm, the wind, the world around me, it all stood still. And then, with one swift movement, he turned and walked away. I exhaled, not realizing I had been holding my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest as I watched him disappear into the night, his figure swallowed by the darkness of the storm. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm myself. Was it him? The man from the stories? Or was it just a coincidence, a man out in the rain like everyone else? I couldn't answer that. But one thing was certain, I would never look at the rain in the same way again. And I would never be able to shake the feeling that I had seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. But the worst part? The next morning, I heard the news. A neighbor, someone I had known for years, had gone missing overnight. The authorities had no leads, no explanation for his disappearance. But I knew, deep down, that the man I had seen that night had something to do with it. Something I couldn't quite understand. Something that had to do with the urban legend that no one had ever taken seriously. And as the days passed, I started to realize something even more chilling. He wasn't gone. He was still out there. Watching. Waiting. But who would be next? The days after the storm passed slowly, the rain now replaced by cold winds and a heavy, gray sky. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest, telling myself it was just a coincidence. A man walking in the rain, nothing more. But deep down, I couldn't let go of the feeling that something wasn't right. It started with subtle things at first. Strange noises at night, scratching sounds coming from the walls, or the floorboards creaking as if someone was moving around in the dark. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling or the wind playing tricks with the old pipes. But then I heard something else, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps that echoed in the silence of the night. They were faint, but unmistakable. I would sit up in bed, my heart pounding, listening to the sound of those steps moving closer, closer to my room. Every time I gathered the courage to peek out from under the covers, the sound would stop. I would wait, straining my ears for any hint of movement, but nothing. It was as if whoever was out there knew exactly what I was watching. I started to dread the nightfall, when the house seemed to come alive with strange noises. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if that man, the one I had seen during the storm, was still here, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. One evening, as I sat by the window, trying to distract myself from the unease that clung to me, I saw him again. But this time, it wasn't just a fleeting figure in the distance. He was standing at the edge of my driveway, barely visible in the growing darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There he was, that same tall figure in the dark coat, standing perfectly still in the rain, staring directly at my house. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. His face was obscured as it always had been, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unnerving, piercing through the distance between us. I thought about calling the police, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I say? That a man had been watching me from across the street? That he was a figure from a local legend? I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was all in my mind. But as I looked back at him, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. His hand was raised, palm open, as if beckoning me. A wave of panic surged through me, and I pulled away from the window, my pulse racing. I ran to the door, flinging it open, but the street was empty. The figure was gone, vanished without a trace. It was as if he had never been there at all. I stood there, heart pounding, my thoughts spinning. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? But I knew deep down that I hadn't imagined it. The man was real. And he was getting closer. For the next few days, the dread only grew. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The feeling of being watched never left me, and every time I went outside, I found myself scanning the streets, expecting to see him standing there, waiting. Then, on the 5th night after I saw him in my driveway, I received a letter. It was an odd envelope, yellowed with age, the edges worn and frayed. My name was written in a neat, but unfamiliar handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands, and what I read inside made my blood run cold. The letter read, "You're not safe. He's coming for you, too." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. Just those chilling words and a strange symbol drawn in the corner. I recognized it from the old stories, the symbol that was said to be tied to the man from the legend, the figure who appeared on rainy nights. I looked around the room, expecting to see him standing in the shadows, but there was nothing. Only the silence, heavy and oppressive. I had no idea who had sent the letter, or how they knew what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure, this was no coincidence. The man from the legend was real, and he was coming for me. I needed answers. And I needed them fast. The letter had given me no clue as to what I should do next, but it felt like a warning. A warning I couldn't ignore. I had to find out who, or what, this man was, and why he was haunting me. Before it was too late. The letter sat on my kitchen table for days, its message haunting me with every glance. "You're not safe. He's coming for you, too." What did it mean? Was I truly in danger? And who had sent it? I had to know more, but where could I even start? I went to the local library, hoping to find any information that could explain the strange occurrences surrounding the figure. The rain was light but constant, tapping on the windows as I sifted through old newspapers and dusty books. The librarian, a woman named Mrs. Mackenzie, looked at me with a knowing expression, her eyes narrowing as I approached the history section. Looking for something specific, she asked, her voice low and almost too quiet, like she knew what I was searching for. I hesitated, not sure how to ask. "Just local legends," I muttered. "Something about a man who appears on rainy nights." Her eyes flickered, and she nodded slowly. "Ah, that one," she said, turning to a shelf at the back of the room. She pulled out a thin, withered book titled "The Forgotten Myths of Our Town." I took it from her, already feeling a sense of unease crawl up my spine. As I flipped through the pages, I found what I was looking for. The story was brief but chilling. The Rain Man is a legend passed down through generations. It is said that on stormy nights, he appears in the shadows, watching those unlucky enough to be alone. He does not speak, only watches. And if you ever meet his gaze, he will follow you, waiting for the right moment to strike. Those who have encountered him are never seen again, and their disappearance is always marked by an eerie silence, as if they were erased from existence. The words felt like they were burning into my brain. I could hardly breathe as I read the chilling passage. The Rain Man, was this the same figure I had seen? And the letter, the warning, it all made sense now. Do you know anything more about him? I asked Mrs. Mackenzie, my voice barely above a whisper. She paused, looking over her shoulder to make sure no one else was around. You should leave this alone, she said, her voice tight with concern. The Rain Man is not just a story. People have vanished over the years, and it's always during storms. But there's more to it than that. There's a ritual, something that keeps him from following you, but it's not easy. And it's dangerous. Ritual? I asked, leaning in, desperate for answers. What kind of ritual? Her face turned pale, and she stepped closer, lowering her voice even more. I don't know the full details, she whispered, but there's a place, an old house on the outskirts of town. It's been abandoned for years, but it's said that if you go there on the night the Rain Man appears, you might find what you need to stop him. I didn't think. I grabbed the book, thanked her, and rushed out of the library, my mind spinning with fear and adrenaline. If there was a chance to stop this, to get rid of the figure that had been haunting me, I had to take it. That night, the storm hit harder than before. The rain poured down in torrents, the wind howling against the windows as I stood by the front door, debating whether or not I should go. The fear in me was overwhelming, but so was the need to know what was really happening. I couldn't keep living in this constant state of dread. I drove to the old house, my headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the twisted trees and overgrown lawn that surrounded it. The place looked abandoned, forgotten by time. But there was something else about it, something unsettling about the way the house seemed to loom in the stormy night, as if it was waiting for me. I parked the car, heart pounding, and stepped out into the wet, cold air. The rain soaked through my clothes instantly, but I hardly noticed. My mind was consumed by one thought: I had to find out the truth. I pushed open the creaky gate and made my way toward the front door, every step echoing in the silence. The wind howled louder, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye, just a fleeting shadow, but it sent a chill down my spine. The door creaked open with a hesitant push, and I stepped inside. The smell of mildew and decay hit me instantly, but I pressed forward. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing an empty hallway, its walls lined with faded portraits of people I didn't recognize. As I walked deeper into the house, I heard it. A soft, slow sound, footsteps. They were distant at first, but they were getting closer. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, straining to hear. The footsteps were no longer distant. They were right behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway stretching out into darkness. Suddenly, the house seemed alive, creaking and groaning in the storm. And then, from the corner of the room, I saw him. The Rain Man. He stood in the shadows, his dark coat blending with the night, his eyes glinting with a cold, knowing stare. I could feel the air grow colder as his figure seemed to shift, moving towards me without a sound. Panic surged through me. I backed up, but my feet caught on something, and I fell to the floor with a crash. The Rain Man stepped forward, his silhouette growing taller, looming over me. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, but I remembered what Mrs. Mackenzie had said. There was a way to stop him. The ritual. But I had no idea what it was. The figure moved closer, and all I could do was stare into his cold, unblinking eyes, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. I lay there, heart racing, paralyzed with fear, staring at the figure of the Rain Man. His form was almost solid now, towering over me with an unnatural presence that felt like a suffocating weight on my chest. I could hear the rain beating against the windows, the wind howling through the broken glass of the house, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was the figure standing in front of me, his cold eyes locking onto mine. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to even blink. His gaze was all-consuming, and in that moment, it felt as though he could see right through me, into the very core of my being. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice barely a sound, barely a breath. The Rain Man didn't answer. Instead, he took another step forward, and that single movement felt like the world was closing in around me. The air grew colder with each passing second, and I felt a sharp, biting chill in my bones. I had to do something. I had to find a way to fight back, to escape. The ritual. I remembered it, something about the house, the place where he came from. My mind was a blur, but I could recall Mrs. Mackenzie's warning. If you go there on the night the Rain Man appears, you might find what you need to stop him. But what was it? What could I possibly do? I wasn't prepared. I wasn't ready. I had no idea how to stop him, how to send him back into whatever realm he came from. The figure of the Rain Man took another step. He was so close now that I could see the wetness of his dark, tattered coat, as though he had stepped right out of the storm itself. The darkness of his form seemed to pulse, as though it was alive. I tried to move, tried to scramble away, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was like I was stuck to the floor, my muscles refusing to respond to my frantic mind. He was here. He was real. And there was nowhere to run. Suddenly, I remembered the old book I had taken from the library. The one that talked about the Rain Man, the one with the vague mention of a ritual. There was something about a mirror. That was it. A mirror. I didn't know how I knew, but the thought hit me like a flash of clarity. The house had mirrors. There had to be one here. I didn't care about the consequences anymore. I just had to try something. Anything. Summoning all the strength I had left, I forced myself up and stumbled across the room, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I searched for something, anything, that could help. The Rain Man remained silent, watching me from the shadows, his gaze never leaving mine. I ran through the hall, into another room, and there it was, a large, antique mirror, its frame intricately carved, standing against the far wall. My breath hitched as I rushed toward it, but something stopped me. The reflection in the mirror. It wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror wasn't just me, it was him. The Rain Man. His face was there, distorted, but unmistakably his. He stood behind me, as if he were already inside the house. I backed away in horror, but the reflection remained. In the mirror, the Rain Man was smiling, his lips curling up into a grin that sent chills crawling down my spine. "Do you think a mirror can save you?" A voice echoed from behind me, his voice cold and hollow. I whipped around, but he was still standing there, inches from me. I hadn't seen him move, but somehow he was closer. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stumbled backward, the mirror's reflection still mocking me. I had no idea what to do. The rain continued to pound on the roof, the house groaning under the weight of the storm. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. And yet, in the chaos of it all, I realized something. The mirror wasn't just reflecting the Rain Man, it was showing me something else. An image began to form in the mirror. It wasn't just his face, it was a scene. A scene of another house, another place, somewhere dark and cold. The shadowy outline of a figure stood in the doorway, watching, waiting. And then the figure in the mirror moved. It was walking toward me. In a panic, I reached out, slamming my hand against the mirror. It was cold to the touch, like ice, but I didn't care. I needed to break it. I needed to shatter whatever was happening here, to stop the Rain Man from reaching through. But as my hand pressed harder against the glass, the reflection of the Rain Man smiled wider. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice echoing in the silence of the house. Then, the mirror cracked. The sound was deafening, like thunder, and the shards of glass fell to the floor. I staggered back, my hands trembling as I looked around the room. The air had changed, thicker, colder, and darker than ever before. I had no time to react. The door slammed shut, and I heard a low growl, a growl that sounded like it was coming from the very walls themselves. The Rain Man was no longer standing in the corner. He was in the room with me. His form, now completely visible, was only inches from my face, his eyes dark and endless. "You were never supposed to see me," he hissed. Before I could move, the house went silent. The storm outside stopped, the wind died down, and in the stillness, I knew. The Rain Man was no longer just a legend. He was real. And he wasn't going to let me go. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, face to face with the Rain Man. Time seemed to stretch, and in the eerie silence, I could feel my heart pounding louder than the storm ever had. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my skin prickled with cold dread. Then, as if to break the tension, the Rain Man took a slow step toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. His voice came again, low and unsettling. "You shouldn't have followed the stories. You shouldn't have opened the door to this place." I tried to speak, tried to ask him why, or how, or what he wanted, but my throat was tight, my words stuck somewhere deep inside me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. The only thing that mattered was that he was here. He was real. And there was no escape. All the others thought they were safe. They thought it was just a myth. "But you called me here," he whispered, his voice a quiet rasp like the wind scraping against metal. My mind raced. I called him here? How could I have possibly done that? "You never understood," he continued, his smile widening, sharp like a blade. "The Rain Man isn't a story. He's a curse, a part of the fabric of this place. Once you know the truth, once you look for me, I come. And you can't unsee me." I finally found my voice, or at least I thought I had. "What truth?" I managed to croak. The Rain Man tilted his head, as though considering my question. For a moment, I thought he might answer, but then he just stared at me with those cold, emotionless eyes. "The truth about how all of this began. The truth about why I walk in the rain, why I exist," he said, his voice almost mechanical now. "Every legend has its origin. Every myth has its roots. The Rain Man isn't some figment of imagination, he's a reflection of what's been forgotten, of what's been buried in the past." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the significance of his words. Something about this house, about this town, was connected to him. Something I had missed or never understood. The people who lived here before you, they knew, he continued, stepping closer still. They tried to erase the truth, but it doesn't go away. It stays hidden, like the rain, falling silently in the background, washing everything away. Until someone comes looking for answers. His words were like a puzzle, each piece falling into place in my mind, but the full picture still eluded me. The feeling of isolation grew stronger, heavier. The house felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing together, suffocating me with every word he spoke. The legend of the Rain Man is the story of a man who never should have died, he said, almost sadly. He was wronged, forgotten, and now I exist in his place. But every year, on the night the storm falls hardest, I return. Not to haunt, not to scare, but to remind. Suddenly, it clicked. The stories I had heard as a child, the whispers from my neighbors, those stories were all part of the same cycle. The cycle of the Rain Man. He wasn't just some ghost or monster, he was a symbol of something far darker. You see, the Rain Man continued, his voice softening, almost as if he were explaining something to a child, there's a cost to the truth. And if you're foolish enough to ask the questions, the answers will come. But they will never be kind. Now that you know, now that you've seen me, you are part of it. His words made my head spin. Part of what? Part of the curse, he said, the smile on his face gone now, replaced by something more ominous. You can't leave. You can never leave. The truth will follow you, like the rain. I felt the weight of his words settle deep in my chest, like a stone that I couldn't throw off. The house seemed to be vibrating now, the walls trembling slightly, as though it, too, were reacting to the truth being revealed. The air grew thicker, colder, the stillness of the storm outside the only sound. I looked around, desperate for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. No door I could run through. No window to climb out of. The Rain Man had made sure of that. You want to know how it ends? He asked, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the pounding of my heart. Before I could answer, before I could even think, the figure of the Rain Man stepped closer until his face was inches from mine, his breath cold against my skin. It ends when you stop asking, he whispered. And in that moment, I understood. There was no escape. There never would be. I had become a part of the story. A part of the myth. And the myth would never let me go. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the Rain Man's smile, his eyes gleaming with the knowledge that he had won. That he would always win. And the rain began to fall. It was past midnight when I first heard the steps. At first, I dismissed them. It was probably just the wind, or maybe the house settling. The kind of sounds that happen when the silence of the night stretches a bit too long. But then, they came again, faint but distinct. Heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate. The kind you hear when someone is walking right outside your door. I tried to brush it off, turning my head to glance at the clock on the nightstand. 1:30. A small flicker of unease spread through me, but I told myself that nothing was wrong. Nothing ever happens here. It's just the neighborhood noises, nothing more. But then the silence that followed the steps was wrong. It was too quiet, too heavy. And that's when I remembered I had a security camera outside my door. I could check it, see who or what was out there. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, the screen glowing as I opened the security app. The live feed popped up, showing the dark outline of my front porch under the weak light from the street lamps. There, standing just outside the reach of the light, was a figure. I froze. It wasn't moving. It was simply standing there, facing directly at the camera. Its form was too still, too unnatural. The figure was tall, with an unidentifiable shape, as if the shadows around it were somehow merging into one. Its face, though obscured by the darkness, seemed to focus on the camera with an almost unnatural intensity. I felt my blood run cold. A wave of anxiety hit me like a freight train, and my heart began to race. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Was this some sick prank? My fingers hovered over the phone, but I couldn't bring myself to call. I didn't want to appear paranoid. What if it was just someone lost? But the feeling of being watched, of being studied, made my stomach churn. The minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The figure didn't move an inch. It was as though it were waiting for something. Or worse, waiting for me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that the figure would eventually leave. It had to, right? This was probably just some strange occurrence. But the more I stared at the screen, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, thinking of checking the lock, even though I knew it was already secured. Suddenly, the figure's head twitched. The motion was slight, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a jolt of fear through me. And then, as if it had noticed me watching, it began to move. But not like a normal person would. The figure didn't walk. It slid. The way it moved was wrong. Its body was too rigid, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it was gliding across the porch. Each shift was accompanied by a faint, sickening scraping sound, as though its feet were never actually touching the ground. The camera was too grainy to make out details, but I could see enough to know that whatever this was, it wasn't human. I could feel my heart in my throat as I watched the figure approach the door, its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, never leaving the camera. It stood motionless again, just outside the door, still and waiting. Then, it happened. The screen flickered, and I lost the feed. I frantically tapped at the screen, but no matter how many times I tried to refresh it, I couldn't get the video to load. The app was malfunctioning, or worse, it had been tampered with. I scrambled off the bed and dashed toward the door, my mind racing. What was going on? Why wasn't the feed working? I turned the doorknob, but it was stuck. My heart sank as I twisted harder, trying to open it. It wouldn't budge. I spun around, looking for something, anything, that could help. My mind screamed at me to call for help, to do something. But my phone was useless now, and there was no other way out. I had to deal with this alone. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound from the other side of the door, a soft thud, like something pressing against it. Then, a voice. Quiet, almost a whisper, but still clearly audible through the thick wood. I'm here. I recoiled, backing away from the door, my legs shaking. I didn't know what to do. The fear that had been creeping at the edges of my mind now overwhelmed me completely. That voice was wrong. It didn't belong. It wasn't real. The thudding continued, growing louder and more erratic, as though whatever was outside was trying to get in, trying to force its way through. I looked around the room, searching for something to defend myself with. There was nothing. The only weapon I had was my own fear, and it wasn't enough. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the thudding stopped. The silence was suffocating. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath, hoping against hope that whatever had been out there had finally gone away. But all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. And then, in the dead of night, the last thing I heard before everything went completely still was that voice again. I'm still here. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I've slept properly since. The figure never left. And I'm not sure it ever will. The next morning, the sun rose with an almost unnatural brightness, as if trying to erase the terror from the night before. I sat in my kitchen, staring at my phone, but the video feed was still down. I couldn't shake the images from my mind, those cold, unblinking eyes, the way the figure had glided toward my door, that voice. It felt like a dream, but I knew it wasn't. I tried to tell myself that it was just a hallucination, a trick of the mind. Maybe the camera was broken, or maybe the stress had gotten to me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The feeling that something was wrong, that someone, or something, was still out there, watching, hadn't gone away. I spent the whole morning checking the locks, even the ones I knew were secure. I called a technician to come and check the security system, but when he arrived, he couldn't find anything wrong. The cameras were working, and there was no sign of tampering. He reassured me that it was probably just a glitch. I wanted to believe him, I really did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. As the day wore on, I found myself becoming increasingly paranoid. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far, every creak in the floorboards felt like someone walking behind me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that the figure would appear at any moment. I couldn't focus on anything. Work, television, even reading, nothing could distract me from the terror that gripped my chest. What had I seen? What had been outside my door last night? That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon and the night crept in, the unease in my stomach returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure hadn't gone anywhere. It was out there, waiting. I found myself staring at the front door, listening for anything. Suddenly, there was a soft knock. My body froze. I slowly approached the door, trying to ignore the panic building in my chest. It could be a neighbor, maybe just someone who had lost their way in the dark. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. But just before I turned it, I stopped. Something told me not to open the door. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I stepped back, breathing hard, not sure what to do. My mind raced, trying to figure out who could be on the other side. But deep down, I already knew it was the same figure. The same presence from last night, now standing outside my door. I could feel it. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the silence. I yanked it out, hoping for some distraction, some sign that everything was going to be okay. It was a message from my friend, Mark. Hey, you alright? I heard something weird happened at your place last night. You good? I felt my heart skip a beat. Mark must have heard something about the figure. But how? I hadn't told anyone. I typed back quickly, trying to keep my voice calm. Yeah, just a glitch with the security camera. I'm fine. Why? He responded almost immediately. It's just. I heard about the guy. The one who shows up at people's houses at night. In your neighborhood, I mean. I thought it was just a story, but. I froze, staring at the message. I hadn't told anyone about what happened. How did he know? I stood there for a moment, staring at my phone, the seconds ticking by in a way that felt wrong. My mind raced. Was he talking about the same figure? Was he aware of something I wasn't? I didn't have time to think any longer. The knocking started again. Louder this time, more forceful. I backed away from the door, my breathing shallow. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? Someone's knocking on my door at night? How could I explain the fear that gripped me, the certainty that whoever or whatever was on the other side was not human? I turned to the window, trying to see outside, but the darkness swallowed everything. I couldn't see a thing. The street lamps cast weak pools of light on the pavement, but they couldn't reach my doorstep. I slowly backed away from the door, my mind spinning. I was afraid to stay inside, but I was terrified to leave. My phone buzzed again, but I ignored it. The knocking was still there, relentless. I had to do something. Gathering all the courage I could muster, I made my way to the back door, deciding to leave through the kitchen. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I had to get away from that front door. It felt like the figure was right there, behind it, waiting for me to make the wrong move. But when I reached the kitchen, I froze. There, through the back window, I saw it. The same figure. Standing in the backyard, looking directly at me. The same rigid posture, the same eerie stillness. It had followed me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed. I stood there, staring at the figure, knowing that there was no escape. I knew one thing for sure, this wasn't a prank. This wasn't a glitch in the system. Someone was out there. And they weren't leaving until they had what they came for. I didn't know what to do. My legs were like lead, too heavy to move, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I stared at the figure in the backyard, its form barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakable. It stood motionless, just like it had the night before. The stillness of it was more terrifying than any movement could have been. The figure wasn't just waiting, it was watching. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind scrambling to understand what was happening. How could it have followed me? How could it have known I was going to the back? The knocking at the front door had stopped, but that eerie silence only made the tension in the house feel thicker. I couldn't trust anything now. It was as if the world outside had become a stage, and the figure was the only player. The idea of leaving the house, of running out into the night, felt worse than staying inside. I wasn't sure if I would make even a few steps before it found me. And yet, the thought of staying here, of waiting for whatever was out there to make its move, it was unbearable. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling. I had to think clearly. The figure was out there. I couldn't just ignore it. It wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. I reached for my phone, but my fingers fumbled, not able to grip it properly. Finally, I managed to unlock the screen. My first instinct was to call Mark, but then I remembered what he'd said. He knew about the figure. He wasn't just asking about me, he was concerned. Maybe, just maybe, he knew something I didn't. I quickly typed a message. Mark, what do you know about this figure? What does it want? The seconds felt like hours, but Mark's response came back almost immediately. It's an old legend. People say it's a man who comes around when something terrible is about to happen. They say he watches, then disappears. But I've never heard of anyone who actually saw him. I thought it was just a myth. My hands went cold, and the phone slipped from my grip, falling onto the floor with a faint clatter. A myth? He thought it was a myth, and yet here I was, trapped in my house with that thing in my yard. The dread surged back. How long had it been out there? Had it been watching me the whole time? And why hadn't it come inside? I glanced back out the window. The figure was still there, still standing in the same spot. It was so still that it almost seemed unreal, like a shadow cast by the moonlight, frozen in time. But I knew better. It wasn't a shadow. It was real. I reached for the blinds, slowly drawing them shut, but not before I saw its head tilt slightly. It was as though it knew I was watching, as though it could sense my every movement. I stepped back, my pulse racing. I was losing control. Everything I thought I understood about the world was slipping away, piece by piece. How could I fight something like this? How could I protect myself from whatever it was? The house felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in. The room began to spin. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it wasn't working. The fear was all-encompassing. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay inside any longer. I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair and hurried to the front door. I knew it was risky, terribly risky, but I had to leave. I couldn't stay here, in this place, with the figure so close. Maybe I could go to a friend's house, call the police, or do something, anything, but staying here felt like a death sentence. I opened the door as quietly as I could, making sure the locks were secure behind me. The night air hit me with a sharp chill, biting through my clothes. I hesitated for a moment, looking around at the empty street. There was no sign of movement, no indication that anything was wrong. But I knew better now. I stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. The world felt different, strange, almost unreal, as if the very fabric of reality had shifted. I took a few steps away from the house, glancing over my shoulder to make sure the figure hadn't followed me. I made it to the corner of the block before I heard the first sound. It was faint, barely noticeable at first. A soft scrape, like shoes dragging along the ground. But it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was following me. The footsteps were slow but deliberate, echoing in the silence of the night. I turned quickly, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty street, the dark houses. But I knew what I had heard. The footsteps stopped. Then, from behind me, a low whisper echoed through the night. "I'm waiting." I whipped around, but once again, there was nothing there. Nothing but the eerie quiet of the empty street. The whisper lingered in the air, hanging like a thread I couldn't escape. I ran. I didn't stop. My feet pounded the pavement as I raced down the street, adrenaline pushing me forward, but every step felt like it took me farther into the unknown. I couldn't outrun the fear that gripped me. The figure was still out there. I could feel it. And it wasn't just watching anymore. It was coming for me. I ran without thinking, my mind consumed by the pounding of my heart and the overwhelming fear that chased me. The streetlights flickered overhead as I dashed down the familiar sidewalk, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The night seemed to stretch on, distorting the world around me. Every shadow seemed to move. Every noise, every rustle of leaves, made my breath catch in my throat. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure behind me. But there was nothing, just the emptiness of the street, the dull hum of the city in the distance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, that something was closing in on me. I turned the corner and kept running, not sure where I was headed. I just knew I had to get away. Get far away from that thing. I didn't even care where I was going anymore, just as long as it was away from my house. But then, just as I reached the next intersection, I felt it. That cold, heavy feeling, like someone was watching me from the shadows. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, any sign of what was out there. The air was thick with tension. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway of a house, half hidden in the darkness, staring at me. It was the same figure. The same shape, the same stance. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of stone. It wasn't just following me anymore, it had caught up, and it was waiting. Watching. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the figure. I tried to run again, but my feet wouldn't move. My mind was racing, but I couldn't make sense of anything. How was this happening? How could it be real? The whisper came again, as clear as the night air, sending chills down my spine. I told you I was waiting. I spun around, the voice echoing in my mind. But once again, there was nothing. Just the empty street, the distant houses, the quiet hum of the city. And yet, I knew it was still out there. Somewhere. Panic surged through me, breaking through the fog in my mind. I needed help. I needed someone. But who could I turn to? Who could possibly understand what was happening? I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed Mark's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. My heart raced, and I was about to hang up when the line finally clicked. Hello? Mark's voice was groggy, but there was a hint of concern in it. Mark, please, you need to help me. It's here. It's real. The figure, I saw it again. It's been following me. My voice cracked as I spoke, the fear in my chest threatening to consume me. Wait. What? Slow down. Are you sure you're not just, imagining things? Mark's voice was steady, but I could hear the hesitation. He was trying to stay calm, but I could tell he didn't fully believe me. I'm not imagining it. It's real, Mark. It's in my head, in my life. I saw it. I heard it. My voice rose in desperation. You have to believe me. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Mark breathing, his thoughts racing, but he didn't speak. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he responded, his voice quiet. I'll come over. Stay where you are. Don't move. I'll be there soon. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I ended the call and shoved the phone back into my pocket, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Mark was coming. He was the only person I could rely on right now, but what if he didn't make it in time? The whispers, the figure, it was all too much. My stomach churned, and my body felt like it was on the edge of collapsing. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to collect myself. I had to move, had to get somewhere safe. But every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay put, to wait for Mark. I glanced around again, my eyes scanning the street, hoping for some sign of safety, some glimpse of reassurance. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the night, broken only by my ragged breathing. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The figure, standing motionless across the street, in front of an abandoned storefront. Its eyes, those dark, empty eyes, locked onto mine. A chill shot through my veins, paralyzing me in place. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It knew I was watching. The whisper came again, but this time it was louder, closer. "I've been waiting for you." I took a step back, my pulse thundering in my ears. My legs felt weak, my mind unable to focus. The words echoed in my head like a constant hum, growing louder and more insistent. Then, just as I turned to run again, I heard something else. A soft rustling sound coming from behind me. A shadow flitted across the alley to my left. I whipped around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the heavy weight of dread that hung in the air. It was closer than ever. The figure wasn't alone anymore. I ran. This time, I didn't look back. I ran without thinking, driven purely by instinct, my feet pounding against the pavement as I fled deeper into the night. The cold air stung my lungs, but it couldn't cut through the terror that consumed me. I didn't dare glance back, not wanting to confirm my worst fear, that the figure had followed me, that it was still there, lurking just out of sight. I could feel it. I could sense it in every creak of the buildings, every whisper of the wind. The streets were empty, the usual hum of the city lost in the vastness of the night. I passed darkened windows, vacant storefronts, familiar landmarks, but everything felt alien now, as if the world had shifted somehow. As if it were no longer the place I had known. I reached an intersection, my legs burning, but I couldn't stop. Not now. The shadows felt closer, like they were closing in around me, their long, twisted fingers reaching for me from the corners of my vision. And then it happened. A figure stepped out from the alley ahead. It wasn't the same figure as before. This one was taller, thinner, almost ghostly. It was the face that struck me most. Pale, gaunt, with eyes too dark to see, too deep to comprehend. It stood there, motionless, blocking my path. For a moment, I froze, my mind too stunned to react. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. But I could feel its gaze, piercing through me, like it was seeing something I couldn't even comprehend. I backed away, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. This was it. There was no way around it. I had no choice but to face whatever this thing was. But how could I? I opened my mouth to scream, to call for help, but no sound came out. The air around me was thick, as if something was pressing in from all sides, holding me in place. The figure took a step forward. And then another. I turned, stumbling over my own feet, desperate to get away, but the world had changed. The street I had been running down was no longer the same. The buildings loomed higher, closer, the alleyways narrowing, the shadows lengthening. The streetlights flickered, casting an eerie glow over everything. I was trapped. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. The sound was unmistakable. It was the same rhythmic pacing I had heard earlier, only now it was louder, more distinct. Closer. I spun around, my heart in my throat. There was no one there. No figure. Just the empty street stretching out before me, bathed in a sickly yellow light. But I could hear it. The footsteps. They were getting louder, growing faster, as though the unseen figure was closing the distance between us. And then the whisper. "You can't escape." The words were low, but they cut through me like a knife. My pulse raced, my hands trembling, my thoughts scattered. I tried to think, tried to make sense of it all, but nothing made sense anymore. The world had become a twisted maze, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I bolted forward, running blindly now, my mind consumed by fear. The footsteps behind me were like a shadow, a presence I couldn't shake. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care, I just needed to get away. Away from the thing that was following me, that had been watching me all along. I turned another corner, and suddenly I was in a different part of town. The streets here were darker, emptier, the buildings more dilapidated. It felt like a ghost town, as though no one had walked these streets in years. Yet something about it felt familiar. Unsettlingly familiar. I stumbled to a stop in front of a rundown apartment complex. The building looked abandoned, its windows boarded up, its door hanging ajar. But I didn't hesitate. I rushed inside, desperate for shelter, desperate for any kind of safety. The lobby was dark, the air stale. I could hear the faint echo of my footsteps bouncing off the walls as I moved through the building, heading deeper into its labyrinthine corridors. Every turn seemed to lead me farther away from the exit, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back out there, not with that thing following me. I pushed open a door at the end of the hall and found myself in an empty apartment. The furniture was old and covered in dust, but the place felt somehow safe. At least for now. I locked the door behind me and backed into a corner, my chest heaving with each breath. The silence in the apartment was deafening, broken only by the sound of my rapid heartbeat. I tried to calm myself, tried to think rationally. This was just a nightmare. It had to be. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was real. The figure outside, the whispering voice, the footsteps that followed me, they were real. And they weren't going to stop until they had me. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the hallway, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. I froze, my body stiff with fear. The figure was here. It was coming. I heard the door handle rattle. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was something more. I couldn't run anymore. The night had come for me. Have you ever walked through a place that felt wrong, even though nothing seemed out of the ordinary? It's that feeling of being watched, of something, or someone, just beyond your line of sight, lurking in the shadows. That's exactly what I felt as I crossed the old bridge on my way home. It was just past midnight. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows over the river below. The only sound was the gentle rush of water beneath me and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The bridge was narrow, made of old stone and wood, its withered beams creaking with each step. I had crossed this bridge countless times before, and I always told myself that the strange noises were just a product of age, a relic of a time long past. But tonight was different. As I stepped onto the bridge, the air grew colder, the chill sinking into my bones. The usual quiet of the night was replaced with an uncomfortable stillness. I glanced around, half expecting someone to be there, but the bridge was empty, as it should have been. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Each step I took seemed to echo louder than the last. My shoes tapped against the wood, the sound unnaturally sharp in the silence. I tried to push the feeling aside, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the more I walked, the more certain I became that I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, my footsteps growing more frantic. The sound of the creaking bridge seemed to match my growing anxiety, the old wood groaning under my weight. But then, just as I reached the middle of the bridge, I heard something else, footsteps. They were soft, almost inaudible at first, but they were there. The faintest sound of shoes scraping against stone. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. I looked around, but there was no one. The bridge was still empty, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was right behind me, walking at the same pace, mirroring my every move. I turned around quickly, expecting to see a person standing there, but the bridge was empty. There was nothing but the wind rustling the leaves in the trees on either side. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was just tired, imagining things. But as I resumed walking, the sound of footsteps returned. This time, they were closer, louder. My heart hammered in my chest. I dared not look behind me again, afraid that if I did, I would see something I wouldn't be able to explain. I told myself to keep moving. I was almost at the end of the bridge now, just a few more steps, and I would be free. But no matter how fast I walked, the footsteps kept pace with me. They were right there, just behind me. The creaking of the bridge grew louder, the sound of footsteps almost deafening now. I could feel them, the presence, as if someone was walking inches behind me. I wasn't alone. Suddenly, the air shifted. It grew colder still, a bone-chilling cold that made me shiver uncontrollably. My breath came out in clouds, the air thick with an unspoken tension. I reached the edge of the bridge, but as I stepped off, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and rasping, right in my ear. "Don't leave." I froze. The voice was so close I could feel it, a cold whisper that sent a shock through my spine. I spun around, my eyes scanning the empty bridge, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty space and the quiet rustling of the wind. And yet, the voice lingered, echoing in my mind. "Don't leave." I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. My feet pounded the ground, my breath ragged in my chest. The feeling of being pursued was overwhelming, like something or someone was just behind me, getting closer with each passing second. I didn't stop running until I reached home, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart was still racing, my mind spinning. I tried to tell myself it was just a bridge, just an old structure creaking and groaning in the night. But deep down, I knew that something had followed me. Something had been there, just beyond the edge of my vision. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge wasn't just a place. It was something more. A portal, perhaps, or a doorway to something that shouldn't be. And that voice. The voice that followed me, whispering its warning. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. A presence that was still there, in the back of my mind, waiting. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going near that bridge again. Not ever again. The days after that night were strange. The haunting feeling never left me, lingering in the corners of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. I couldn't tell anyone about what had happened. Who would believe that a voice from nowhere had followed me across an empty bridge? I couldn't explain it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I tried to go about my normal routine, but every time I left the house, my thoughts would drift back to the bridge. The old wood creaking underfoot. The footsteps that had mirrored mine. The voice. It all felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. It was one afternoon, a few days later, when I found myself walking near the bridge again. I hadn't meant to go there. I wasn't sure why my feet had led me to the same spot. It was like some magnetic pull, as though something was drawing me back. The bridge stood before me, just as it always had, silent, weathered, and unmoving. But today, it seemed different. More menacing. The wind had picked up, swirling around me, carrying with it the faintest scent of dampness and decay. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, and I hesitated. The memory of the voice sent a cold shiver down my spine. But still, my feet carried me closer. As I stepped onto the bridge, I felt the familiar creak beneath me, each step echoing louder than before. The bridge had always been old, but it never felt this alive. The air seemed heavier, more oppressive. I paused for a moment, glancing down at the dark water flowing beneath. There was something unsettling about the stillness of it, as if the river itself was holding its breath. That's when I heard it. A sound. A faint scraping noise, like the dragging of something heavy across the ground. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise came from behind me. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I didn't need to. I already knew what it was. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and drawing closer with every second. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, the wind howling around me. The footsteps came to a sudden stop, and then silence. Pure, suffocating silence. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my pulse racing in my ears. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I was rooted to the spot, unable to break free. Then, I heard the voice again. Turn around. I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was behind me, but the voice, that chilling whisper, urged me forward, beckoning me to face it. Turn around. I didn't know what I was expecting, but what I saw sent a surge of terror through my entire body. There, standing at the far end of the bridge, was a figure. Tall and unmoving, draped in a dark coat that blended with the shadows. Its face was obscured by the hood, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I stood there, frozen, unable to speak or move. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. It simply stood, watching, waiting. My breath came in shallow gasps as I fought the urge to scream. The seconds stretched on forever, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who was this person? What did they want? And why was I being forced to face them now, after everything that had happened? Suddenly, the figure took a step forward. A soft creak echoed in the silence, as if the very bridge itself was protesting its movement. With each step, the figure seemed to grow closer, yet still, it said nothing. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my legs finally finding the strength to move. I turned and ran, not looking back, my footsteps pounding against the wood of the bridge. The sound of my breath, heavy and ragged, filled my ears. I could feel it again, the presence behind me, following, just out of sight but never far away. I didn't stop until I reached the other side, my chest heaving with the effort. The air around me was thick with dread, and the bridge behind me was silent once more. I turned, half expecting to see the figure still standing at the far end, but there was nothing. The bridge was empty, silent as it had always been. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was I just imagining it? Had it all been in my head? Or had I truly crossed paths with someone that shouldn't be there? The one thing I knew for certain was that I could never go back. Not to that bridge. Not to whatever waited there, in the shadows. I tried to tell myself that what happened on the bridge was just a bad experience. Something my mind had conjured in a moment of stress, maybe a trick of the light, or the isolation of the old structure playing games with my senses. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure in the hooded coat. Those cold, empty eyes staring back at me. I tried to push it away, to focus on anything else, but every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind outside sent my heart into a frenzy. I could still hear that voice in my head, faint but clear. Turn around. I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. The feeling of being watched, the sound of footsteps when no one was around, the persistent dread that seemed to follow me everywhere. I started to question my own sanity. Was I imagining things? Had I become so consumed by the strange events that I was now seeing threats where there were none? I went to work the next day, trying to put everything behind me, but the unease lingered. Every corner seemed darker, every sound more sinister. At lunch, my colleague, Anna, noticed my distraction. She looked at me, concern creasing her brow. "Are you okay?" "You've been acting a little off," she said, her voice gentle. I wanted to say I was fine, that everything was just in my head, but the words got stuck in my throat. How could I explain what was happening? How could I make anyone understand that something was out there, something I couldn't explain? "I'm just tired," I said finally, forcing a smile. "It's nothing." But Anna wasn't convinced. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You know, there's a story about that bridge. The old one near your house." I froze. She had no idea what had happened, yet here she was, bringing it up as if it was something normal to talk about. My pulse quickened, and I looked at her, trying to keep my composure. "What story?" I asked, though I already knew. She glanced around, then spoke in a hushed tone. "They say that bridge is haunted. People have seen things on it. Strange figures, voices, even disappearances. My grandmother used to tell me about it when I was little. She said it's cursed." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and I had to fight the urge to stand up and leave. My heart was pounding now, not from fear, but from a sickening certainty. The bridge wasn't just old, it was something more. And whatever was on it that night, whatever I had seen, wasn't a figment of my imagination. "Why do you bring that up?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Anna shrugged, oblivious to the effect her words were having on me. "I don't know. It just came to mind. Maybe you should stay away from it for a while." She gave me a weak smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I nodded, though my mind was already racing. What if there was more to this than I realized? What if the bridge wasn't just a place, but a doorway to something far worse? I left work early that day. My thoughts were a whirlwind of doubt and fear. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure on the bridge, the voice, the cold that had settled in my bones. I felt like I was being drawn back to it, like something was waiting for me, something I couldn't escape. As I approached my home, I saw the old bridge in the distance. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over it, and it looked so normal. Too normal. It beckoned to me, as if daring me to return. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to confront whatever haunted that place. But something deep inside me told me I had no choice. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe I hoped that by facing it, I could finally put an end to the fear, to the sense of being watched. But as I stepped onto the creaking planks once more, I felt a growing certainty that I was not alone. And then I heard it. A whisper. "Come closer." I froze, my blood running cold. This time, the voice was unmistakable. It wasn't a trick of the wind or my imagination. It was real. It was there. I turned, slowly, and saw the figure again, standing at the far end of the bridge, just as it had before. The same dark coat, the same hollow eyes staring into mine. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. "Come closer," it repeated, its voice growing stronger, clearer. I felt an overwhelming urge to obey, a compulsion I couldn't resist. It was like the figure was pulling me in, like the bridge itself was calling me closer. But I couldn't do it. Something inside me screamed to stay back, to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. I took a step back. Then another. And another. But the figure didn't follow. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I didn't stop until I was off the bridge, standing in the safety of the streetlight. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Whatever had been on that bridge, whatever had called to me, wasn't something I could face. Not yet. And maybe never. But I knew one thing for sure now. I wasn't safe. Not as long as that bridge existed. And as long as it stood, the figure would be waiting. I didn't sleep that night. My mind was a blur of thoughts, fragments of images, dark figures, empty eyes, and the terrifying feeling of being drawn into something I couldn't understand. The shadows of the bridge haunted me, their cold grip tightening with every passing hour. I kept seeing the figure, always standing still, watching, waiting. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I had made it out, that it was just a bad encounter. But deep down, I knew better. Something about that bridge, about the figure, had changed me. I felt like a thread had been pulled, and now I was tangled in a web I couldn't escape. The next day, I decided I had to learn more. Maybe if I understood what I was dealing with, I could find a way to stop it. I went to the local library, hoping to find something, anything, about the bridge, about the legends Anna had mentioned. The librarian, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and thick glasses, greeted me with a warm smile. "Looking for something in particular?" she asked. "I'm trying to find information about the old bridge near my house," I said, forcing my voice to sound casual. "I heard it has some history." Her smile faded slightly, and she glanced over her shoulder as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "Ah, the bridge," she murmured. "There are stories, yes. But I wouldn't worry about them if I were you." "Why?" I asked, curious. "Some things are better left unknown," she replied, her voice low. "But if you insist, I have a few old books on local history. They might mention it." She led me to a shelf in the back of the library and handed me a dusty volume. It was thick, the pages yellowed with age, and the cover was worn. I opened it carefully, scanning the index for any mention of the bridge. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the pages, each one telling stories of forgotten places, strange occurrences, and legends long lost to time. Finally, I found it. A small chapter dedicated to the bridge, tucked between stories of old mill towns and abandoned farms. The title read, "The Cursed Bridge." I took the book to a nearby table and began to read, my eyes scanning quickly over the words. The bridge had been built over 100 years ago, and almost from the moment it was finished, strange things began to happen. People claimed to have seen figures standing at the edge, staring into the water below, only to vanish without a trace. Locals spoke of footsteps following them late at night, of whispers on the wind, and of the faint glow of lanterns seen at the far end of the bridge, even when no one was there. But the most disturbing legend was that of a man dressed in a long, dark coat who appeared at night. His face was always hidden, obscured by the hood of his coat. Some said he was a spirit, others believed he was a cursed soul trapped between worlds. And every few years, someone would disappear, last seen walking toward the bridge. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I read on. The stories matched what I had experienced. The figure, the whispers, the strange sense of being drawn toward the bridge, it was all in the book, as if the writer had known exactly what had happened to me. But there was more. The book mentioned that the bridge had been built over an old burial ground, a site of ancient rituals. It was said that the spirits of those buried there had never found peace. Some believed they still lingered, tied to the land, and that the bridge itself had become a gateway for them to cross into the living world. I closed the book, my hands shaking. I knew now that the bridge wasn't just a structure, it was a place of power, a place where the boundary between life and death was thin. And whatever I had seen on the bridge, whatever had followed me home, wasn't something I could ignore. It was tied to that place, to the darkness that lived in the stone and wood. I had to go back. I had to face whatever it was, once and for all. But I wasn't sure if I was ready for what I might find. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I barely heard my phone ring, barely noticed the hours slipping away. All I could think about was the bridge and the figure, the shadow that haunted my every step. As night fell, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to return to the bridge. I grabbed my coat and headed out the door. The night was cold, and the wind carried with it the smell of rain. The sky was overcast, the moon barely visible behind the clouds. It felt like the perfect night for something strange. When I reached the bridge, the creaking of the wooden planks beneath my feet was the only sound in the air. My heart pounded in my chest as I crossed the bridge, the distant sound of rushing water below almost drowned out by the pounding of my own pulse. And then I saw it. The figure. It stood at the far end of the bridge, just like before. But this time, it wasn't motionless. It was slowly turning toward me, the hood still obscuring its face. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them, piercing, cold. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't speak, but I could feel the weight of its presence, pressing down on me, urging me forward. For a moment, I hesitated. I wanted to run, to turn around and flee, but something inside me held me in place. The figure's presence was overwhelming, but it was also familiar. Like I had seen it before. Like I had always known it would be here, waiting for me. "Why are you here?" I whispered, the words slipping from my lips before I could stop them. The figure didn't respond, but I could feel the air growing colder, the darkness deepening. It was as if the world around me was bending, warping, becoming something else entirely. And then, in the silence, a voice, faint but clear, echoed in my mind. "Because you called me." The world around me seemed to twist, and I realized with a shock that I wasn't alone. Something else was with me now, something ancient, something far older than the bridge itself. And I had just awakened it. The voice lingered in my mind, its words like ice settling deep in my chest. "Because you called me." My breath came in shallow gasps, my heartbeat racing so fast I thought it might break free of my chest. I couldn't move. The bridge beneath my feet seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows growing deeper with every second. The figure remained still, its presence oppressive, its silence deafening. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but my body betrayed me, frozen in place. The air grew colder, and the darkness around me thickened, swallowing the faint light of the moon. I could barely make out the figure's outline now, but I could feel its weight, its eyes. Somehow I knew they were on me. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just a voice in my head. It was as though the air itself had become alive, pulsing with a strange energy. "Come closer." The words weren't an invitation, they were a command. My feet moved, almost against my will, as if drawn by some invisible force. I took one step, then another, the sound of my shoes on the wooden planks deafening in the silence. The world around me felt distant, unreal, as though the bridge had become a place outside time and space. I was almost at the center of the bridge now, standing only a few feet from the figure. My hands were shaking violently, but I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't break free of the pull. And then, in a sudden movement, the figure took a step toward me. My heart skipped a beat. For the first time, I could see it clearly. Its face was hidden by the hood, but I could feel it, its presence suffocating. The figure didn't speak. But I could hear it, I could feel it moving inside my head, the whispers coming faster now, growing louder, filling every corner of my mind. "You've come to me," it said, the voice not one, but many, a chorus of ancient voices, as if they were all speaking through it. "You've always known, haven't you? You've known this place, this bridge, this moment." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. My feet faltered, and I nearly lost my balance, but I caught myself, the cold air biting at my skin. "No," I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. "No, I didn't know. I didn't ask for this." The figure stepped forward again, its form growing clearer. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something under the hood, eyes gleaming with an ancient, terrible hunger. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. "You didn't ask," the figure said, its voice softer now, more sinister. "But you called me all the same. You walked this path. You sought answers. You woke me." I shook my head desperately, trying to fight the grip tightening around my chest. "No, I didn't. I was curious. I didn't know what this was." The figure let out a low, hollow laugh. "Curiosity," it whispered, as though tasting the word. "Curiosity has a price." And then it moved again, so quickly that I barely had time to react. Its hand, no, its fingers, extended toward me. I couldn't pull away, couldn't scream. The air around me was thick, heavy, and the world itself felt like it was bending under its weight. In that moment, everything changed. The bridge seemed to shift, as if the ground beneath me was no longer solid. I could feel the darkness pressing in from all sides, the sounds of the wind becoming sharper, colder, until they were no longer sounds at all, but whispers. Faint, distant murmurs, growing louder and louder until they filled my ears completely. The voices, they weren't just the figure anymore. They were everywhere, circling me. The ground trembled beneath my feet. The figure's fingers were inches away from me. I could feel its cold, relentless presence. And then, in a flash, everything stopped. The whispers faded. The air cleared. I found myself alone on the bridge again. The figure was gone. The shadows that had filled the space were now just the ordinary darkness of the night. But something had changed. Something was different. I turned around, half expecting to see the figure looming behind me, its eyes watching from the shadows. But there was nothing. No one. Just the creaking of the bridge, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. But I knew, deep down, that I hadn't imagined any of it. The figure, the voices, the feeling of being drawn into something I couldn't escape. It had all been real. I took a few unsteady steps back toward the edge of the bridge, my mind racing. What had just happened? What was that thing? And why had it let me go? Then, as I reached the end of the bridge, I heard something that made my heart stop. A voice. A whisper. Soft, but clear. You'll be back. I spun around, but there was nothing. The bridge was empty. I ran, and as I crossed the threshold of the bridge and stepped onto solid ground, I thought I saw something just for a moment at the far end, waiting. The darkness was still there, watching, waiting, and I knew deep down it wasn't over. It had only just begun. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.